Real mothers don't work full-time, Patricia sneered across the dinner table. It's selfish, really. Children need their mothers. I set down my fork and smiled. You're absolutely right, Patricia. Let me show you exactly what a real mother's work is worth. 3 days later, I handed her an itemized bill for 27 years of unpaid labor. She went completely silent and hasn't spoken to me since. I never thought I'd be the type of person to calculate the monetary value of motherhood, but Patricia Chen had a way of pushing people to their breaking point. My mother-in-law had been making passive-aggressive comments about my career for years, but that Sunday dinner was different. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It wasn't just another snide remark about daycare, or questioning whether I was present enough for my children. It was a full-scale assault on everything I'd worked for, disguised as concern for my family's well-being. My name is Rachel Martinez, and I'm a cardiac surgeon at Seattle General Hospital. I've been married to David Chen for 8 years, and we have 2 beautiful children together, Emma, who's 6, and Lucas, who just turned 4. When I met David in medical school, his mother seemed thrilled that he was dating someone with such ambitious career goals. She would brag to her friends about how her future daughter-in-law was going to be a doctor, how smart and accomplished I was. That enthusiasm lasted exactly until I actually became successful. The shift started subtly after Emma was born. Patricia would visit our home and make seemingly innocent observations about how tired I looked, how maybe I should consider taking a step back from such a demanding career. When I returned from maternity leave after 12 weeks, she asked David if I was really ready to leave such a tiny baby with strangers. The word strangers was always emphasized, as if our carefully vetted loving nanny was some random person we'd picked off the street. By the time Lucas arrived, 2 years later, Patricia's comments had evolved into full lectures about child development and attachment theory. She'd forward me articles about the importance of maternal bonding and studies about children of working mothers. Always with a sweet smile, and the disclaimer that she was just looking out for her grandchildren's best interests. David would usually deflect or change the subject, but he never directly confronted his mother about her behavior. He'd tell me privately that she meant well, that she was from a different generation, that I shouldn't take it personally. The thing is, I understood where some of her concerns might come from if they were genuine. Being a cardiac surgeon means long hours, emergency calls, and sometimes missing bedtime stories, or school events. It's not an easy career to balance with family life, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't struggle with guilt sometimes. But Patricia's comments never felt like they came from a place of genuine worry about her grandchildren. They felt like attacks on my character, my choices, and my worth as a mother. What made it worse was that Patricia had never worked outside the home herself. She'd married David's father straight out of college and dedicated her life to being a housewife and mother. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that choice, and I respected the path she'd taken for her own life. But she seemed to believe that her way was the only valid way to be a good mother, and she was determined to make me see the error of my supposedly selfish ways. The Sunday dinner that changed everything started like so many others. David and I had driven over to his parents' house in Bellevue with the kids for our monthly family meal. Patricia always cooked elaborate spreads for these dinners: roasted chicken, homemade dumplings, 3 different vegetables, fresh fruit, and dessert. She took pride in her cooking, and I genuinely appreciated the effort she put into these meals. It was one of the few areas where we connected without conflict. Emma and Lucas were in good moods that day, chattering about their week at school and daycare respectively. Emma had just learned to read chapter books, and was excitedly telling her grandmother about the series she'd discovered about a girl detective. Lucas was showing off his latest artwork, a finger painting of what he claimed was our family standing in front of our house. Patricia was smiling and engaging with them, and for a moment I thought we might actually have a peaceful evening. The conversation during the early part of dinner was pleasant enough. David's father, Robert, asked about my recent cases, and I shared a success story about a complex valve replacement surgery I'd performed the week before. The patient was a 42-year-old father of 3, who'd been told by another hospital that his condition was inoperable. Patricia even seemed engaged, asking questions about the procedure, and nodding approvingly when I explained how we'd managed to save the man's life. But then Emma mentioned that I'd missed her school's art show because I'd been in surgery, and the atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. It was subtle at first. Patricia's expression tightened just slightly, and she made a small sound under her breath. Emma wasn't upset about it. She'd understood when I explained that I couldn't leave in the middle of an operation, and David had taken beautiful photos to show me everything later. But Patricia latched onto this detail like a dog with a bone. "Oh, that's such a shame," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "School events are so important for children. They remember when their parents aren't there." She reached over to stroke Emma's hair. "But I'm sure Mommy wishes she could have been there, doesn't she, sweetheart?" Emma looked confused by the question. "Mommy saves people's hearts," she said matter-of-factly. "She told me the man might have died if she left to see my pictures." This response should have ended the conversation, but Patricia wasn't finished. "Of course, darling," she said, still speaking directly to Emma but clearly intending her words for me. "It's just that some jobs are more flexible than others. Some mothers can arrange their schedules around their children's important moments." The implication was crystal clear, even if she hadn't said it outright. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat and tried to redirect the conversation to Lucas's soccer league, but Patricia wasn't ready to let it go. She'd found her opening, and she was going to take full advantage of it. As we moved on to dessert, she brought up a news article she'd read about children's academic performance and parental involvement. Then she mentioned a neighbor whose daughter had started acting out after her mother returned to work full-time. I could feel the familiar knot of frustration building in my chest, but I kept my voice calm and pleasant. I'd learned over the years that reacting emotionally to Patricia's provocations only gave her more ammunition. Instead, I tried to engage with her points thoughtfully, explaining the research I'd read about the benefits of children seeing their mothers as capable professionals, the importance of economic security for families, and the fulfillment that came from using my skills to help people. But Patricia had made up her mind long ago, and no amount of reasoning was going to change it. As David started clearing the dinner plates, she leaned back in her chair and delivered the line that would ultimately end our relationship forever. "You know, Rachel," she said, using the tone someone might use to explain something to a child, "I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I really believe that real mothers don't work full-time, not when their children are young. It's just not natural." She paused to let that sink in, then continued. "I understand that women today feel pressure to have careers, but children only get one childhood. You can't get those years back." The room fell completely silent. Even the kids seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though they probably didn't understand exactly what. David's face had gone pale, and his father was staring down at his dessert plate like it held the secrets of the universe. But Patricia wasn't finished with her lecture. "I see how tired Emma and Lucas get when they have those long days at daycare," she continued, her voice taking on a martyred quality. "And I worry about the values they're learning from spending so much time with caregivers who don't love them the way family does. Children need consistency, stability, the security of knowing their mother will always be available when they need her." I felt something inside me snap, but not in the way Patricia probably expected. Instead of getting angry or defensive, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. For years I'd been trying to justify my choices to this woman, trying to make her understand that being a working mother didn't make me a bad parent. But sitting there listening to her lecture me about what real mothers do, I realized that she was never going to respect me or my decisions. More importantly, I realized that I didn't need her to. "You're absolutely right, Patricia," I said, my voice steady and calm. Both David and his father looked at me in surprise. They'd clearly expected me to argue or defend myself as I had so many times before. But I wasn't going to give Patricia the satisfaction of another emotional debate. Instead, I was going to do something that would make my point far more effectively than any argument ever could. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what mothers really contribute to their families," I continued, reaching for my purse and pulling out my phone. "You've made it very clear that you don't value the work I do outside the home, so maybe we should focus on the work I do inside it." Patricia looked confused but pleased, probably thinking she'd finally gotten through to me. David was watching me with a concerned expression, clearly trying to figure out where I was going with this. But I knew exactly what I was doing. For the first time in years of dealing with Patricia's criticism, I had a plan. I think you'd be very interested to see some calculations I've been working on, I said, opening the Notes app on my phone and pretending to scroll through something. Since you believe that motherhood should be a full-time, unpaid job, I thought it might be helpful to figure out what that job would actually be worth in the current market. The confusion on Patricia's face was deepening, but she was still nodding along, probably thinking I was about to agree with her position. Well, yes, she said, motherhood is priceless. You can't put a dollar value on that kind of love and dedication. Actually, I said, still maintaining my calm, pleasant tone, I think you can, and I think it's important that we do, especially since you seem to think that what I do at the hospital somehow makes me less of a mother than someone who stays home full-time. David was starting to look alarmed, and his father had stopped pretending to eat his dessert, but I wasn't going to back down now. Patricia had spent years making me feel guilty about my career choices, questioning my dedication to my children, and implying that I was a selfish, inadequate mother. It was time for her to understand exactly what kind of work she was dismissing so casually. So here's what I'm thinking, I said, putting my phone away and looking directly at Patricia. Since you believe so strongly in the value of traditional motherhood, and since you've made it clear that you don't think working mothers can provide the same level of care for their children, maybe it would be helpful for you to see a detailed breakdown of exactly what I do for Emma and Lucas outside of my job at the hospital. Patricia was nodding enthusiastically now, clearly thinking she'd won some kind of victory. Yes, exactly. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Being a mother is the most important job in the world. Great, I said, standing up from my chair. Then you won't mind if I send you an itemized bill for all the mothering work I've done over the years. You know, just to make sure we're all on the same page about what that work is actually worth. The smile on Patricia's face faltered for the first time all evening. I'm sorry, what? Well, you've made it very clear that you think my job at the hospital is less important than my job as a mother, I explained, still using that same calm, reasonable tone. So I thought it would be helpful to separate those two roles, and make sure the more important one gets the recognition and compensation it deserves. David was staring at me with wide eyes, and I could see him trying to figure out whether I was serious or just making a point. But I was deadly serious. Years of Patricia's condescending comments and lectures had led to this moment, and I was going to make the most of it. I don't think I understand, Patricia said slowly, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. It's really quite simple, I replied. You believe that being a mother is more valuable than being a cardiac surgeon. You've told me repeatedly that real mothers don't work full-time, implying that my career somehow diminishes my role as a parent. So I think it's only fair that we establish the actual value of the work I do as a mother, separate from my medical career. I could see the wheels turning in Patricia's head as she tried to figure out where this was going. She was clearly sensing that she'd walked into some kind of trap, but she couldn't quite identify what it was yet. Rachel, David said quietly, maybe we should just know. David, I said, cutting him off gently but firmly. Your mother has very strong opinions about how I should prioritize my roles as a mother and a professional. I think it's important that we have a clear understanding of exactly what she's asking me to give up. I turned back to Patricia, who was now looking decidedly uncomfortable. The smugness had completely disappeared from her expression, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like worry. So here's what I'm going to do, I continued. I'm going to calculate the fair market value of every hour I've spent on childcare, housework, meal preparation, shopping, transportation, educational activities, medical appointments, and all the other tasks that fall under the category of motherhood. Then I'm going to send you a bill for services rendered over the past 6 years of Emma's life, and 4 years of Lucas's life. Rachel, that's ridiculous, Patricia stammered. You can't charge someone for being a mother. That's not how families work. Exactly, I said, my voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. You can't put a price on motherhood. Which is why it's so interesting that you seem to think my job saving people's lives is somehow less valuable than the unpaid labor I do at home. The room had gone completely silent, except for the sound of Patricia's labored breathing. I could see her trying to formulate a response, but she was clearly struggling to find a way out of the logical trap she'd walked into. But that's different, she finally said, her voice weaker than it had been all evening. I didn't mean I just think that children benefit from having their mothers available. And they do, I interrupted. Emma and Lucas have access to their mother 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The only difference is that during some of those hours, I'm using my medical training to save lives, which provides our family with the financial security that allows me to give them the best possible care during all the other hours. David was watching this exchange with fascination and growing alarm. I could see him trying to decide whether to intervene, but I wasn't finished making my point. The thing is, Patricia, I said, sitting back down and leaning forward slightly. You've spent years telling me that what I do at the hospital somehow makes me less of a mother. You've questioned my priorities, my dedication to my children, and my understanding of what they need. You've made it clear that you think staying home is inherently more valuable than working outside the home. Patricia's face was getting red now, and she was gripping her napkin tightly in her lap. I never said you were a bad mother. No, I agreed. You just said that real mothers don't work full-time. You've implied repeatedly that my career is selfish, that I'm missing out on important moments with my children, and that they're suffering because I'm not available every minute of every day like you were for David. I paused to let that sink in, then continued with the same calm tone I'd been using throughout this entire conversation. So I think it's only fair that we establish exactly what you think motherhood is worth. If staying home with children is so much more valuable than my job as a cardiac surgeon, then surely the work I do as a mother should be compensated accordingly. This is absurd, Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was starting to understand that she'd been backed into a corner of her own making. Is it? I asked. You're the one who's been telling me for years that motherhood is the most important job in the world. You're the one who's been criticizing me for having priorities outside of childcare and housework. So let's establish what that most important job in the world is actually worth. David finally found his voice. Rachel, I think maybe we should take a break from this conversation. Actually, David, I said, turning to face him, I think this conversation is long overdue.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Your mother has been questioning my choices and my parenting for years, and you've asked me repeatedly to just ignore it or let it slide. But I'm tired of being made to feel guilty for having a career that I love and that helps people. I stood up again and walked over to where Patricia was sitting. She actually leaned back in her chair as if she was afraid I might physically attack her, which would have been funny if the situation weren't so serious. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice still calm but with an underlying firmness that made it clear I wasn't going to be argued out of this decision. I'm going to go home tonight and calculate exactly what my services as a mother have been worth over the past 6 years. I'm going to research current market rates for childcare, housekeeping, meal preparation, tutoring, transportation, and every other service I provide for Emma and Lucas. Patricia's eyes were wide now, and she was shaking her head slightly as if she could make this whole conversation disappear through sheer force of will. Then, I continued, I'm going to compile all of that information into a detailed, itemized bill and send it to you. Since you believe so strongly that motherhood is more valuable than my medical career, I'm sure you'll be happy to see exactly what that value amounts to in real dollars. You can't be serious, Patricia whispered. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, I replied. You've spent years telling me that I'm not a good enough mother because I work outside the home. You've questioned every choice I've made, criticized every decision, and made it clear that you think I'm selfish for having a career. So now you're going to see exactly what you've been dismissing. I walked back to my chair and picked up my purse, signaling to David that it was time to go. Emma and Lucas had been quietly playing with their napkins during this entire exchange, probably sensing that the adults were having a serious conversation but not understanding the details. Come on, kids, I said in a bright, normal voice. It's time to head home. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, Patricia sat frozen in her chair, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or frustration or even confusion, it was fear. She was finally beginning to understand that she'd pushed me too far, and that the consequences were going to be very different from what she'd expected. David was quiet during the drive home, and the kids fell asleep in their car seats within 10 minutes. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he turned to me with a concerned expression. Rachel, he said carefully, you weren't really serious about sending my mother a bill, were you?
I looked at him for a long moment, thinking about all the years I'd spent trying to prove myself to his mother, all the times I'd bitten my tongue when she made her snide comments, all the guilt I'd carried about whether I was really doing right by our children. "David," I said finally, "your mother has spent 6 years telling me that I'm not a good mother because I work outside the home. She's questioned every choice I've made and made it clear that she thinks my career is selfish and harmful to our children. Tonight she told me that real mothers don't work full-time." I paused to collect my thoughts, then continued. "So yes, I'm absolutely serious about sending her that bill. She wants to know what real motherhood looks like. She's about to find out exactly what it's worth." The next morning I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. David had tossed and turned all night, clearly hoping I'd change my mind about what I'd promised Patricia. But as I made coffee and watched Emma and Lucas eat their breakfast before school, I knew there was no backing down. Patricia had finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she was about to learn exactly what she'd been taking for granted all these years. After dropping the kids off at their respective schools, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. I had vacation days saved up, and this felt like the most important project I'd ever undertaken. I set up my laptop at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, ready to document every single thing I did as a mother that Patricia seemed to think was less valuable than her precious full-time homemaking. I started with the basics. Childcare in Seattle runs anywhere from $25 to $40 an hour for qualified caregivers, and that's just for basic supervision. I calculated that conservatively I spent about 60 hours a week actively caring for Emma and Lucas when I wasn't at the hospital. That included mornings before school, evenings after work, overnight care, and full weekends. Even at the lower rate of $25 an hour, that came to $1,500 a week, or $78,000 a year, just for basic child care. But Patricia's criticism went far beyond basic supervision. She'd made it clear that she thought real mothers provided educational enrichment, emotional support, medical care, transportation, meal planning, and a dozen other specialized services. So I decided to price those out separately, using current market rates for each service. Personal chef services in our area cost between $50 and $75 an hour. I spent approximately 10 hours a week planning meals, grocery shopping, and preparing food for the family. At $60 an hour, that was another $31,000 annually. House cleaning services charged between $30 and $50 an hour, and I easily spent 15 hours a week on laundry, organizing, deep cleaning, and maintaining our home. Another $39,000. Educational tutoring runs $60 to $100 an hour, and I spent countless hours helping Emma with her homework, reading to both children, teaching them new skills, and supporting their academic development. Even at the conservative rate of $60 an hour for just 5 hours a week, that was another $15,600 yearly. Transportation services, including the specialized child transportation companies that Patricia always criticized me for not using more often, charge between $25 and $40 an hour, plus mileage. Between school pickup and drop-off, medical appointments, extracurricular activities, and social events, I easily spent 8 hours a week driving the children around. That was another $16,600. Personal shopper services charge between $40 and $60 an hour, and someone had to buy clothes, shoes, school supplies, birthday presents, and all the other items that children constantly need. Another $5,000 annually for the 2 hours a week I spent on that task. Medical care coordination, which included everything from scheduling appointments to researching symptoms to communicating with doctors and specialists, was perhaps the most valuable service I provided. Practice management coordinators in medical offices earn between $25 and $40 an hour, and I easily spent 3 hours a week managing the children's healthcare needs. Another $6,000. But the real kicker was the overnight care. Patricia had always made snide comments about how lucky I was that the children slept through the night, as if their good sleep habits had nothing to do with the consistent routines and security I provided. Professional overnight childcare for 2 children costs between $200 and $300 per night in Seattle. Even if I only counted 5 nights a week and gave Patricia's precious full-time mothers the weekends off, that was another $65,000 annually. By the time I finished calculating just the basic services, I was looking at a total of over $250,000 per year, and that was being conservative with both the hours and the rates. I hadn't even begun to factor in the emotional labor, the mental load of managing everyone's schedules and needs, or the specialized skills I brought to parenting because of my medical training. But I wasn't finished. Patricia's criticism had always focused on the idea that working mothers couldn't provide the same level of attention and devotion as stay-at-home mothers. So I decided to calculate what that premium level of care would cost if purchased from professionals. Elite nannies in Seattle, the kind who provide the individualized attention and educational enrichment that Patricia claimed was so important, charge between $35 and $50 an hour. If Patricia believed that children needed that level of care for all their waking hours, not just when their working mother was available, that would cost over $100,000 annually, just for the upgraded child care. Personal assistants who manage family schedules, coordinate appointments, and handle logistics charge between $30 and $50 an hour. The mental load of managing a family's entire life is easily a 20-hour-per-week job. Another $52,000. Nutritionist consultations, which would be necessary to provide the kind of optimized meal planning that Patricia always implied I was failing to deliver, cost between $100 and $200 per session. With monthly consultations and ongoing support, that was another $3,000 annually. Educational consultants who develop enrichment programs and monitor academic progress charge between $75 and $150 an hour. For the kind of intensive educational support that Patricia claimed stay-at-home mothers naturally provided, we were looking at another $8,000 yearly. Child psychologists and family counselors, who would be needed to provide the emotional support and development guidance that Patricia insisted only full-time mothers could deliver properly, charge between $100 and $200 per session. With bi-weekly sessions for optimal child development, that was another $13,000. The more I calculated, the angrier I became. Not just at Patricia, but at myself for never realizing how much I was actually doing. Every criticism she'd ever made about my parenting suddenly looked ridiculous when I saw the dollar amounts attached to replacing my services with professionals. By noon I had compiled a spreadsheet that would have impressed my colleagues at the hospital. I'd broken down every aspect of motherhood into billable services, researched current market rates, and calculated both conservative and premium pricing structures. The conservative estimate came to over $300,000 annually. The premium version, which represented the level of care that Patricia claimed stay-at-home mothers provided, topped $450,000. But I still wasn't satisfied. Patricia's comments had spanned 6 years of Emma's life and 4 years of Lucas's life. She'd been criticizing my mothering since Emma was born, questioning every choice and implying that I was shortchanging my children by working outside the home. If she really believed that motherhood was so valuable, then she should see the cumulative cost of all those years of service. I opened a new spreadsheet and began calculating backwards. For Emma's first year, when I was still completing my residency and working even longer hours than I do now, I conservatively estimated that my mothering services would have been worth $200,000. Patricia had been particularly critical during that period, suggesting that I was missing crucial bonding time and developmental milestones. Year 2, when Emma was a toddler and required constant supervision and entertainment, jumped to $250,000. That was the year Patricia started forwarding me articles about the importance of stay-at-home mothers for language development and social skills. By year 3, when Emma started preschool but still needed extensive care and support, my services were easily worth $300,000 annually. Patricia had made several comments that year about how sad it was that I was missing so many firsts because of my work schedule. Years 4, 5, and 6 brought increasingly complex needs as Emma started elementary school, developed friendships, and required more sophisticated educational and emotional support. I calculated $350,000 for each of those years. Lucas's first 4 years followed a similar pattern, with costs starting at $200,000 and escalating to $350,000 as his needs became more complex, and Patricia's criticism became more pointed. When I added everything up, the total came to over $2.8 million. That was the conservative estimate of what my services as a mother had been worth during the years that Patricia had been questioning my dedication and priorities. But the premium calculation, which reflected the level of care that Patricia claimed was necessary for proper child development, came to over $4.2 million. That was what it would have cost David and his family to replace me with the kind of professionals who could provide the intensive, individualized attention that Patricia insisted all good mothers delivered. I stared at the numbers on my screen for a long time, feeling a mixture of vindication and rage. Patricia had spent years making me feel guilty about my career, questioning whether I was doing enough for my children, and implying that stay-at-home mothers were inherently superior parents. But when I looked at the actual value of the work I was doing, it became clear that I was providing services that would cost millions of dollars to replace professionally. The next step was creating the actual bill. I opened a fresh document and began formatting it like the invoices I'd seen from contractors and service providers. At the top, I put my name and contact information, followed by Patricia's. Below that, I added the dates of service, June 15, 2018 through August 15, 2024, for Emma, and March 3, 2020 through August 15, 2024 for Lucas. Then came the itemized breakdown. I listed every service I provided, the hours spent on each task, the market rate for professional provision of that service, and the total cost. Child care supervision, educational enrichment, meal planning and preparation, household management, transportation services, medical care coordination, schedule management, emotional support and counseling, overnight care, emergency response, and specialized medical consultation using my professional training. For each category, I provided detailed explanations of what the service included and why it was necessary for proper child development. I quoted the same research studies that Patricia had forwarded me over the years, showing how each type of care contributed to children's well-being and success. The basic bill came to $2.8 million. But I wasn't finished. At the bottom of the invoice, I added a section for premium care differential. This reflected the additional cost of providing the level of individualized full-time attention that Patricia claimed was necessary for optimal child development. I explained that while the basic rates reflected standard professional child care, Patricia's criticism had always focused on the superior quality of care that stay-at-home mothers supposedly provided. Therefore, I was adding a premium charge to reflect that higher level of service. The premium differential brought the total to $4.2 million. Finally, I added a payment terms section, payment due within 30 days of receipt. Interest charges of 18% annually will be applied to overdue balances. This invoice reflects services already rendered and is non-negotiable. I printed the 16-page document on professional letterhead and put it in a manila envelope addressed to Mrs. Patricia Chen. But before I mailed it, I wanted to add a cover letter that would make my point absolutely clear. Dear Patricia, I began. Thank you for your feedback during our dinner conversation on Sunday evening. Your comment that real mothers don't work full-time helped me realize that I haven't been properly accounting for the value of my maternal services. As you pointed out, motherhood is the most important job in the world, and it's time that work was compensated accordingly. I continued with a detailed explanation of how I'd calculated the charges, emphasizing that I'd used conservative estimates and current market rates for professional services. I noted that the premium charges reflected her stated belief that stay-at-home mothers provided superior care to working mothers. I'm sure you'll agree that this level of dedication and service deserves appropriate compensation, I wrote. Since you've made it clear that you value traditional motherhood over professional careers, I trust you'll be pleased to see exactly what that motherhood is worth in today's market. I concluded with a paragraph about payment expectations and my willingness to discuss the charges in detail, if she had any questions about the methodology or calculations. After printing the cover letter, I sealed everything in the envelope and drove to the post office to send it certified mail. I wanted to make sure Patricia received it, and that I had proof of delivery. As I handed the envelope to the postal clerk, I felt a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't experienced in years. That evening, David came home from work with a worried expression. He'd clearly been thinking about our conversation the night before, and was hoping I'd come to my senses during the day. So he said carefully as we prepared dinner together, "Did you have a good day off? Get some rest." "Actually," I replied, chopping vegetables for the salad. "I spent the day working on that project I mentioned last night. Calculating the value of my services as a mother." David's face went pale. Rachel, please tell me you didn't actually send your mother a bill. I absolutely did. I continued chopping vegetables as if we were discussing the weather. $4.2 million to be precise. That's the conservative estimate of what my mothering services have been worth over the past 6 years. David set down the pot he was holding and stared at me. $4.2 million. Rachel, that's insane. You can't seriously expect. I don't expect anything, I interrupted. The bill is for services already rendered. Your mother has spent years telling me that motherhood is more valuable than my medical career, so I thought she should see exactly what that value amounts to in real dollars. But she's never going to pay that, David said, sounding almost panicked. It's impossible. No one has that kind of money just sitting around. I looked at him calmly and smiled. Then maybe she should have thought about that before she decided to lecture me about what real mothers do. The envelope arrived at Patricia's house 2 days later. I knew because I'd requested delivery confirmation, and I received an email notification when she signed for it. For the rest of that day, I found myself checking my phone constantly, waiting for the explosion I knew was coming. It didn't happen immediately. In fact, the first 24 hours after delivery were completely silent. No angry phone calls, no outraged text messages, no demands for explanation. I began to wonder if Patricia had even opened the envelope, or if she'd decided to ignore it entirely.
But on Friday morning, my phone started ringing at 7:30. David's number showed on the caller ID, but when I answered, it was Patricia's voice on the other end. "What is this?" she demanded without any greeting or preamble. Her voice was shaking with what sounded like a combination of rage and disbelief. "Good morning, Patricia," I said pleasantly. "I assume you received my invoice. Did you have questions about any of the line items?" "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "You can't charge someone for being a mother. It's the most absurd thing I've ever seen." "Really?" I asked, maintaining my calm tone. "Because just a few days ago, you were telling me how valuable motherhood is. You said it was the most important job in the world. I thought you'd be pleased to see that I finally understand what that job is worth. This isn't. You can't seriously expect me to pay this," Patricia stammered. "Well," I replied, "the terms are clearly stated at the bottom of the invoice. Payment is due within 30 days, with interest charges applied to any overdue balance." I used standard business practices for the billing structure. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Patricia breathing heavily, clearly trying to figure out how to respond to this situation she'd never imagined finding herself in. "Rachel," she said finally, her voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard from her before, "this is going too far. I know you're upset about what I said at dinner, but this is not the way to handle it." "Actually," I said, "I think this is exactly the right way to handle it. You've spent 6 years questioning my priorities, and telling me that I'm not a good enough mother because I have a career. You've made it clear that you think stay-at-home mothers are superior to working mothers. So I thought it was time we established exactly what you think my mothering is worth." "But $4 million. $4.2 million, I corrected, "and that's using conservative estimates. If you'd like me to recalculate using premium rates for all services, the total would be significantly higher." Patricia made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Rachel, please, this is insane. You're being vindictive and cruel." "I'm being accurate," I replied. "Every charge on that invoice reflects current market rates for professional services. If you think motherhood is so valuable, then you should be happy to see that value quantified in real terms." "I never said your mothering wasn't valuable," Patricia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "We both knew that wasn't true." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling through my notes, "let me read you a few things you've said over the years. Real mothers don't work full-time. Children need their mothers to be available. Daycare workers don't love them the way family does. Some jobs are more flexible than others." Should I continue? Patricia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was much smaller than it had been at the beginning of the conversation. "I just think children benefit from having their mothers at home," she said weakly. "And I think children benefit from having mothers who are fulfilled, financially secure, and using their talents to help other people," I replied. "But the difference between us is that I've never criticized your choice to stay home with David. I've never implied that you were a bad mother because you didn't have a career outside the home.
That's different, Patricia said, but she didn't sound convinced of her own argument anymore. How is it different? I asked. You made a choice that worked for your family. I made a choice that works for mine. The only difference is that you've spent years making me feel guilty about my choice while I've respected yours. Another long pause. I could hear voices in the background and realized that David must be at his parents' house, probably trying to mediate this situation. Rachel, Patricia said finally, can we please just forget about this whole thing? I promise I won't make any more comments about your career. I'm afraid it's too late for that, I replied. The invoice has been issued for services already rendered. Your comments over the years made it clear that you didn't value the work I was doing as a mother, so I thought it was important to establish that value in terms you might understand. But I can't pay this amount, Patricia said, and for the first time she sounded genuinely scared rather than angry. Then maybe you should have considered that before you decided to lecture me about what real mothers do, I said. The terms are clearly stated on the invoice. If you have questions about the methodology or calculations, I'd be happy to provide additional documentation. I could hear David's voice in the background, clearly trying to get Patricia to hand him the phone. After a moment of muffled conversation, his voice came on the line. Rachel, he said, sounding exhausted, this has gone far enough. You've made your point, can we please just end this now? I haven't made any point, David, I replied. I've simply provided an accurate accounting of the services I've rendered as a mother over the past 6 years. Your mother values traditional motherhood so highly that I thought she deserved to see exactly what those services cost in today's market. But you can't seriously expect her to pay millions of dollars. David protested. I expect her to understand that the work I do as a mother has real value, I said. Whether or not she chooses to pay the invoice is entirely up to her. But the next time she wants to lecture someone about what real mothers do, maybe she'll think twice about the financial implications of that advice. David was quiet for a moment, and I could hear Patricia crying in the background. When he spoke again, his voice was very careful and measured. What would it take for you to forgive this whole thing? He asked. What do you want from her? I considered the question seriously. What did I want? An apology would be nice, but Patricia had never apologized for anything in the 8 years I'd known her. A promise to stop criticizing my choices would be better, but I'd heard those promises before, and they'd never lasted. I want her to understand that being a working mother doesn't make me a bad parent, I said finally. I want her to recognize that the work I do at the hospital is valuable and important, not selfish or harmful to my children. And I want her to stop questioning every choice I make as if I'm some kind of neglectful mother who doesn't care about her family. She understands that, David said quickly. Don't you, Mom? I could hear Patricia sniffling in the background, but she didn't respond directly. Actually, I continued, I don't think she does understand that. Because if she did, she never would have told me that real mothers don't work full-time. She never would have spent years making me feel guilty about having a career that I love and that helps people. Rachel, David pleaded, she's an old woman from a different generation. She doesn't always express herself in the best way, but she loves you and the kids. Does she? I asked. Because spending 6 years criticizing someone's choices and questioning their priorities doesn't feel like love to me. It feels like judgment and disapproval. There was another long pause, and I could hear whispered conversation in the background. Finally, Patricia's voice came back on the line, shaky but determined. Rachel, she said, I'm sorry if I made you feel bad about working. That wasn't my intention. If you made me feel bad, I repeated. Patricia, you've spent 6 years telling me that I'm not a good enough mother because I work outside the home. You've questioned every choice I've made and implied that I'm harming my children by having a career. That's not an if situation. I just want what's best for Emma and Lucas, she said defensively. And what makes you think I don't? I asked. What makes you think that providing them with financial security, showing them that women can have successful careers, and using my skills to help other people, isn't what's best for them? Patricia didn't have an answer for that question, which didn't surprise me. She'd never thought through the logical implications of her criticism, never considered that there might be benefits to having a working mother that outweighed the perceived disadvantages. The invoice stands, I said finally. If you'd like to discuss payment terms or dispute any of the charges, you can contact me in writing. Otherwise, payment is due within 30 days as stated. I hung up the phone before anyone could respond, feeling both satisfied and emotionally drained. The conversation had gone exactly as I'd expected, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. Patricia still didn't understand why her comments had been so hurtful, and I doubted she ever would. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 8 years of marriage to David. For 3 weeks, Patricia didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up unannounced at our house, like she usually did every few days. David would come home from work, looking increasingly stressed, reporting that his mother was barely speaking to anyone, and had canceled her weekly lunch dates with friends. Apparently, she was too embarrassed to explain why her daughter-in-law had sent her a multi-million-dollar invoice. I went about my daily routine as if nothing had changed. I dropped Emma and Lucas off at school, performed surgeries at the hospital, attended parent-teacher conferences, and helped with homework. The difference was that for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the constant weight of Patricia's disapproval. I wasn't second-guessing every parenting decision or feeling guilty about missing a school event because of work. The freedom was intoxicating. David, on the other hand, was falling apart. He'd grown up as the only child of parents who'd rarely disagreed about anything, and the idea that his wife and mother were engaged in what he saw as an all-out war was completely foreign to him. He kept asking me to be the bigger person and find a way to make peace with Patricia. When I pointed out that I'd been the bigger person for 6 years, while his mother criticized everything I did, he'd get frustrated and retreat to his home office. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in early September. I was helping Emma with a science project about the human heart when David burst through the front door looking more upset than I'd ever seen him. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his tie was crooked, and his face was flushed with anger. "She's in the hospital," he announced without preamble. I looked up from Emma's poster board, immediately shifting into medical mode. "What happened? Which hospital? Do you need me to call someone?" "She had what they're calling a panic attack," David said, loosening his tie with shaky hands. "My dad found her hyperventilating in the kitchen this morning. She kept saying something about owing money she doesn't have and ruining the family's reputation." Emma looked between us with wide eyes, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding the context. I guided her toward the living room with her project materials and told her to work on the drawings while the adults talked. "David," I said carefully, "I'm sorry your mother is unwell, but you can't blame me for her reaction to receiving an accurate accounting of services rendered." "Services rendered?" David exploded. "Rachel, she's a 72-year-old woman who's never seen that much money in her entire life. She thinks you actually expect her to pay millions of dollars for being a grandmother." "She's not being billed for being a grandmother," I corrected. "She's being billed for the mothering services she's spent years telling me weren't valuable enough to justify my career. If she'd valued my work as a mother, she wouldn't have constantly criticized it." David sat down heavily on one of the kitchen stools and put his head in his hands. "The doctor said her blood pressure was dangerously high. She's been having trouble sleeping and hasn't been eating properly. My dad is worried she's having some kind of breakdown." I felt a small pang of concern, but it was quickly overshadowed by years of accumulated frustration. "Patricia brought this on herself, David. I didn't force her to spend 6 years questioning my parenting and telling me that real mothers don't work full-time. I simply quantified the value of the work she claimed wasn't important." "But you know she can't pay that amount," David said, looking up at me with pleading eyes. "It's impossible. It would bankrupt them 10 times over." "Then maybe she should have thought about that before she decided to devalue my contributions to this family," I replied. "Actions have consequences, David. Your mother spent years making me feel like a failure as a mother. Now she gets to understand exactly what she was criticizing." David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with competing loyalties. Finally he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "What if I paid it?" I stared at him in disbelief. "What did you just say?" "The invoice," he said, not meeting my eyes. "What if I found a way to pay it? We could take out loans, liquidate our retirement accounts, sell the house if we had to. Would that end this whole thing?" The fact that he was even considering this option told me everything I needed to know about how little he understood what was really happening. This wasn't about money. This had never been about money. David, I said slowly, do you seriously think I want $4 million from your mother? I don't know what you want anymore, he admitted. A month ago, I thought we were a happy family. Now my mother is in the hospital. You're sending bills for millions of dollars, and I feel like I'm living in some kind of nightmare. I walked over to where he was sitting and took his hands in mine. For the first time since this whole situation began, I felt genuinely sorry for him. He'd been caught in the middle of a conflict he didn't understand and had no idea how to resolve. David, I said gently, I don't want your mother's money. I never wanted her money. What I wanted was for her to stop treating me like a selfish, neglectful mother just because I have a career outside the home. Then why did you send the bill? He asked, confusion evident in his voice. Because sometimes the only way to make people understand the value of something is to show them what it would cost to replace it, I explained. Your mother spent years telling me that what I do at the hospital doesn't matter as much as what I do at home. So I calculated exactly what it would cost to replace my services at home with professional providers. David was still looking confused, so I continued. The point wasn't to collect money. The point was to make her understand that being a working mother doesn't mean I love my children less or provide them with inferior care. It means I'm providing services that would cost millions of dollars to replace while also saving lives at the hospital. So you'll tear up the invoice? David asked hopefully. I shook my head. The invoice stands. But Patricia doesn't have to pay it in money. What do you mean? I mean there are other forms of payment. I said, respect for instance, acknowledgement of the value of my contributions to this family. An understanding that working mothers aren't inferior to stay-at-home mothers, just different. David looked even more confused now. I don't understand what you're asking for. I'm asking for your mother to stop criticizing my choices, I said simply. I'm asking her to acknowledge that I'm a good mother, even though I work outside the home. I'm asking her to treat me with the same respect she'd show any other professional woman. She does respect you, David protested, but even he didn't sound convinced. David, I said, 3 weeks ago, your mother told me that real mothers don't work full-time. She implied that I was harming my children by having a career. She made it clear that she thought I was a selfish, inadequate parent. Does that sound like respect to you? He was quiet for a long moment, finally beginning to understand the true scope of what had been happening in his family for years. What do you want me to do? He asked, finally. I want you to have an honest conversation with your mother, I said. I want you to tell her that her criticism of my career and my parenting has been hurtful and inappropriate. I want you to make it clear that you support my choices and that you expect her to do the same. And if she agrees to that, you'll forgive the debt. If she genuinely understands why her behavior was wrong and commits to changing it, then yes. But it has to be genuine, David. Not just an apology to make this go away, but a real understanding of why what she did was harmful. David nodded slowly, and I could see him processing everything I'd said. After a few minutes, he pulled out his phone and called his father. Dad, it's me, he said when Robert answered. How is Mom doing? Is she still at the hospital? There was a pause while his father responded. Okay, I'm coming over. There are some things we need to discuss. After David left for the hospital, I sat in the quiet kitchen and reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few weeks. The constant stress of dealing with Patricia's criticism was gone, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Emma and Lucas were thriving, completely unaware of the adult drama that had been playing out around them. My work at the hospital was as fulfilling as ever, and for the first time since becoming a mother, I didn't feel guilty about loving my career. It was nearly midnight when David returned home. He looked exhausted but less stressed than when he'd left. I was reading in bed when he came into our bedroom and sat down heavily on his side of the mattress. How is she? I asked, closing my book. Better, he said. The doctor is releasing her tomorrow morning. Her blood pressure is back to normal, and she's been able to eat something. That's good, I said. And I meant it. Despite everything that had happened, I didn't want Patricia to be genuinely ill. We talked, David continued. For a long time, longer than we've talked about anything in years. I waited for him to continue, not wanting to push but curious about what had been said. She really didn't understand how her comments were affecting you, he said finally. She thought she was being helpful, giving advice based on her own experiences raising children. David, I said carefully, telling someone that real mothers don't work full-time isn't advice. It's judgment. I know, he said quickly. I told her that. I explained how her comments had been making you feel, and I think she finally started to understand. What did she say? David was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. She said she never meant to hurt you. She said she was proud of your accomplishments and didn't realize that her comments were undermining that. I waited to see if there was more, but David seemed to be finished. That's it, I asked. She wants to talk to you, he said. She asked if you would come to the house tomorrow evening so she could apologize properly. I considered this request. Part of me was skeptical that Patricia had really changed her perspective so dramatically in the course of one evening. But another part of me was curious to hear what she had to say. All right, I said finally. I'll go talk to her. But David, I need you to understand that this isn't going to magically fix years of accumulated hurt. If your mother wants to rebuild our relationship, it's going to take time and consistent effort. I understand, he said. And Rachel, thank you for being willing to try. The next evening, I drove to Patricia and Robert's house alone. David had offered to come with me, but I felt this was a conversation that needed to happen between Patricia and me without any intermediaries. As I parked in their driveway, I noticed that the lights were on in the living room but the house seemed unusually quiet. Robert answered the door with a subdued expression and led me to the living room where Patricia was sitting in her favorite armchair. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Her usually perfect hair was slightly mussed, and she was wearing a simple sweater instead of her usual carefully coordinated outfit. Rachel, she said, as I entered the room, thank you for coming. Please, sit down. I chose the sofa across from her chair, maintaining some physical distance while we navigated this conversation. Robert excused himself to the kitchen, giving us privacy to talk. I owe you an apology, Patricia began, her voice quieter than usual. A very big apology. I waited for her to continue, not wanting to make this easier for her by jumping in with reassurances. David helped me understand that my comments about your work have been hurtful, she continued. I never intended to make you feel bad about your career or your parenting. I thought I was offering helpful perspective based on my own experiences. Patricia, I said gently, when you tell someone that real mothers don't work full-time, that's not helpful perspective. That's judgment about their choices. She nodded slowly, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. You're right, I see that now. I let my own experiences and beliefs cloud my judgment about what was best for your family. It's not just about what's best for my family, I said. It's about respecting that different families make different choices, and that working mothers aren't inferior to stay-at-home mothers. I know, she said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. I'm ashamed that it took such a dramatic wake-up call for me to understand how wrong I was. We sat in silence for a few moments while Patricia composed herself. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. I want you to know that I think you're an excellent mother, she said. Emma and Lucas are wonderful children, and that's because of the love and care you and David provide for them. Your career doesn't diminish that, it enhances it. I felt a loosening in my chest that I hadn't even realized was there. Hearing those words from Patricia felt like validation I'd been seeking for years without even knowing it. Thank you, I said simply. That means a lot to me. I also want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished professionally, she continued. You save people's lives, and that's incredible. I should have been celebrating your success instead of questioning your priorities. I appreciate you saying that, I said, and I meant it. Patricia reached into the drawer of the side table next to her chair and pulled out a familiar manila envelope. It was the invoice I'd sent her, still sealed in its original packaging. I never opened this, she said, holding it up. David told me what it was, but I was too afraid to look at the actual numbers. Do you want to know what it says? I asked. She shook her head. I don't need to see the specifics. David explained that it shows how much your services as a mother would cost if we had to hire professionals to replace you. The point is that what you do has real value, both at home and at the hospital. I nodded. That was exactly the point. Patricia stood up and walked over to the fireplace. Without ceremony, she tossed the unopened envelope into the flames. We both watched as it caught fire and slowly burned to ash. "Consider the debt forgiven," she said, turning back to me with a small smile. "And I promise you I will never again question your choices about work and family. You have my word." As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Patricia and I would probably never be best friends, but we could coexist respectfully as family members. More importantly, I no longer had to carry the burden of her disapproval or question my own worth as a mother. The real victory wasn't in proving that my mothering services were worth millions of dollars. It was in finally standing up for myself and demanding the respect I deserved. Sometimes the most important battles aren't about winning or losing, but about refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. Patricia never spoke to me again about working full-time after that evening. In fact, she rarely spoke to me at all, unless it was absolutely necessary. Our relationship became politely distant, which was exactly what I'd hoped for.
She attended family gatherings, was kind to Emma and Lucas, and treated me with the basic respect she'd show any acquaintance. It wasn't warm, but it was peaceful. The silence wasn't golden, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, that was more than enough. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen preparing Emma's lunch for school when she asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Mommy, why doesn't Grandma Patricia talk to you much anymore?" I looked down at my 6-year-old daughter, who was sitting at the breakfast table swinging her legs and genuinely curious about the family dynamics she'd observed. Lucas was too young to notice the shift, but Emma had always been perceptive about adult relationships. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements and need space to work things out," I said carefully, not wanting to burden her with details she was too young to understand. "But you're not fighting anymore, right?" she pressed. Because Grandma was really nice at my birthday party, she was right. Patricia had attended Emma's 7th birthday party the month before and had been perfectly pleasant. She'd brought a thoughtful gift, helped serve cake, and even complimented the themed decorations I'd spent hours creating. But there was a distance there that hadn't existed before, a careful politeness that replaced the casual familiarity we'd once shared. "No, sweetheart, we're not fighting," I assured her. "We just have a different kind of relationship now." That evening, David and I were folding laundry together when he brought up something that had been on his mind. "My mom asked if she could take Emma and Lucas for a weekend next month," he said, not looking up from the towel he was folding. "Just her and my dad, no other family around." I paused in my folding, considering this request. Patricia hadn't asked to have the children overnight since our confrontation 6 months earlier. She'd been consistently respectful during family gatherings, but she'd also kept her interactions with me brief and formal. "What do you think?" David asked when I didn't respond immediately. "I think that would be good for the kids," I said honestly. "They love spending time with their grandparents, and they shouldn't suffer because Patricia and I had to work through some issues." "Are you sure?" David pressed. "I don't want you to feel pressured if you're not comfortable with it." I smiled at my husband, appreciating his consideration. The past 6 months had been a period of growth for our marriage as well. David had learned to stand up for me when necessary, and I'd learned to communicate my needs more directly instead of letting resentment build up over years. "I'm sure," I said, "Emma and Lucas deserve to have relationships with both sets of grandparents, and Patricia has never been anything but loving toward them." 2 weeks later, I hugged my children goodbye as Patricia and Robert picked them up for their weekend adventure. Patricia and I exchanged polite pleasantries about the weather and the kids' schedules, but the conversation felt natural rather than strained. We'd both learned to navigate this new dynamic with grace. That Saturday morning, for the first time in months, David and I had the house completely to ourselves. We slept in until 9, made elaborate pancakes for breakfast, and spent the afternoon working in our garden without any interruptions. It was peaceful in a way that made me appreciate how much stress had been lifted from our family life. "Do you ever miss it?" David asked as we were planting new roses in the backyard. "Miss what?" I replied, not immediately understanding what he was referring to.
The way things used to be with my parents. Before all this happened, I considered his question seriously. There had been good times with Patricia, especially in the early years of our marriage. She could be warm and generous when she wasn't feeling threatened or judgmental. But those good moments had been overshadowed by years of constant criticism and undermining. I miss the potential of what we could have had, I said finally. I miss the idea of having a mother-in-law who was genuinely supportive, but I don't miss walking on eggshells, or constantly defending my choices. David nodded thoughtfully. I think this new arrangement is probably healthier for everyone. I agree, I said. Sometimes maintaining distance is the most loving thing you can do for a relationship. That evening, as we were enjoying a quiet dinner at our favorite restaurant, my phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia. I almost ignored it, assuming it was just an update about the kids, but something made me check. Thank you for trusting us with Emma and Lucas this weekend. The message read, they're wonderful children, and it's clear they're being raised with love and strong values. I hope you're enjoying your time with David. I showed the message to David, who read it with surprise. It was the first time Patricia had directly acknowledged my parenting in a positive way since our confrontation. That's progress, he said simply. It is, I agreed, and I meant it. The following Monday at work, I was reviewing surgical schedules when my colleague Dr. Jennifer Walsh stopped by my office. Jennifer was a fellow cardiac surgeon, and one of the few other working mothers in our department. I heard an interesting rumor, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with a curious expression. Oh, I replied, not immediately concerned. Hospital gossip was usually benign. Someone told me you sent your mother-in-law $1 million bill for childcare services. Jennifer said with a grin. Please tell me that's true, because if it is, you're my new hero. I laughed, realizing that somehow my story had made its way through the hospital grapevine. It was actually $4.2 million, and it wasn't for childcare services specifically. It was for comprehensive maternal services rendered over 6 years. Jennifer's eyes widened. You're serious. You actually did it. I did, I confirmed. Sometimes the only way to make people understand the value of something is to show them what it would cost to replace it. That's brilliant, Jennifer said. I'd been dealing with similar criticism from my ex-husband's family for years. They're constantly implying that I'm a bad mother because I work long hours. Maybe I should send them a bill too. Just make sure you research current market rates, I advised with a smile. Accuracy is key to making the point effectively. Over the next few weeks, I heard from several other working mothers who'd gotten wind of my story. Some thought I'd gone too far, but many more expressed admiration for finally standing up to the subtle and not-so-subtle criticism that working mothers face regularly. A few even asked for advice on how to handle similar situations in their own families. It made me realize that my conflict with Patricia wasn't unique. Countless women struggle with judgment about their choices to work outside the home, often from the very people who should be supporting them most. The guilt and self-doubt that Patricia had fostered in me were experiences shared by working mothers everywhere. 3 months later, at Lucas's 4th birthday party, something unexpected happened. Patricia approached me while I was setting up the bounce house in our backyard. Rachel, she said quietly, could I speak with you for a moment? We walked to a corner of the yard where we could talk privately while still keeping an eye on the children playing. I wanted to tell you something, Patricia began, looking slightly nervous. My friend Margaret has been dealing with some criticism from her daughter about working too much. She's a nurse, and her daughter thinks she should retire now that she has grandchildren to help care for. I listened, not sure where Patricia was going with this story. I found myself defending Margaret. Patricia continued, explaining how valuable her work is, how much her patients need her skills, how working mothers can provide things for their children that stay-at-home mothers can't. She paused, seeming to gather her courage before continuing. As I was talking, I realized I was describing you. Everything I was saying about Margaret applied to your situation too. I was defending her choices while I'd spent years criticizing yours for the exact same thing. I felt a shift in my chest, a loosening of something I hadn't even realized was still there. It made me understand, really understand, how wrong I was, Patricia said, her voice getting quieter. Not just wrong in my conclusions, but wrong in my approach. I had no right to judge your choices or question your priorities. Thank you for telling me that, I said sincerely. It means a lot to hear you say it. I hope someday we can have a real relationship again, Patricia said. Not the polite distance we have now, but something genuine. I know I have to earn that, and I'm willing to work for it if you're open to the possibility. I looked at this woman who had caused me so much stress and self-doubt over the years. She looked genuinely remorseful, not just sorry for the consequences of her actions, but truly understanding of why those actions had been wrong. I'd like that too, I said, but it will take time, and it will require consistent respect for my choices going forward. I understand, Patricia said. And Rachel, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Proud of your career, proud of your parenting, proud of how you handled our conflict. You stood up for yourself with dignity, and that took courage. As I watched Patricia walk back toward the birthday party, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope for a genuinely positive relationship with my mother-in-law. Not the tense politeness we'd been maintaining, but real respect and affection. That evening, after all the party guests had gone home, and the kids were asleep, David and I sat on our back porch enjoying the quiet. My mom seems different lately, he observed. More thoughtful, maybe, less quick to judge. People can change, I said. Sometimes they just need the right motivation. Do you think you'll ever be close again? David asked. I considered the question. I don't know if we'll ever be close in the traditional sense. Too much has happened for that. But I think we can have a respectful, caring relationship. And honestly, that might be better than what we had before. Better how? More honest, I said. Built on mutual respect instead of expectations and assumptions. Sometimes a relationship has to break completely before it can be rebuilt on a stronger foundation. David reached over and took my hand. I'm proud of how you handled all this. It couldn't have been easy to stand up to her the way you did. It wasn't easy, I admitted. But it was necessary. And I'm glad I did it even though it was scary at the time. As we sat there in comfortable silence, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that dinner 6 months ago, when Patricia had told me that real mothers don't work full-time. I was still the same person, still balancing the same career and family responsibilities, but I no longer carried the weight of her disapproval or questioned my own worth as a mother. The invoice had never been about money. It had been about demanding the respect I deserved, and refusing to accept treatment that diminished my value. Sometimes the most important victories aren't about winning or losing, but about standing up for yourself with dignity, and forcing others to see you clearly. I still loved my work at the hospital, still found deep satisfaction in saving lives and using my skills to help people. But now I also loved my role as a mother without guilt or defensiveness. I could attend Emma's school events when my schedule allowed and miss them when it didn't, knowing that my presence or absence at any single event didn't define my worth as a parent. Patricia and I would probably never be best friends, but we no longer had to be adversaries. We could coexist as family members who respected each other's choices and valued each other's contributions. It wasn't the warm, supportive relationship I'd once hoped for, but it was honest and peaceful, and sometimes that's enough. The best part was that Emma and Lucas remained completely unaware of the adult drama that had played out around them. They continued to love both their parents and their grandparents, benefiting from relationships that were now built on mutual respect rather than hidden resentment. As I looked back on those 6 months of conflict and resolution, I realized that standing up for myself had been one of the most important things I'd ever done. Not just for me, but for my children, who were learning that self-respect and dignity aren't negotiable, and for other working mothers who might be inspired to demand the respect they deserve. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept treatment that doesn't honor your worth. And sometimes, just sometimes, that refusal can transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.